sharp slap echoed through the boarding area, freezing the entire space. All the usual airport noise, the overhead announcements, the chatter of travelers, the rolling of suitcase wheels against the floor, vanished in an instant. A wooden cane slipped from a frail hand, tumbling a few times on the polished tile. An elderly woman stood still, her bright eyes blinking beneath silver hair. Her fingers, slightly trembling, tightened around the strap of her handbag. But it wasn't pain that made her grip it tighter. It was something else entirely. In front of her, a tall flight attendant stood with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line, as if she had just done the right thing. "I told you to step aside," she said, her voice laced with irritation. The passengers nearby stood frozen. Some covered their mouths in shock, others leaned toward each other, whispering in hushed tones. A man in a tailored suit, standing not too far away, furrowed his brows, but before he could speak, the elderly woman slowly bent down. She picked up her cane, each movement deliberate, as if every gesture carried its own weight. Then, standing tall once more, she locked eyes with the flight attendant. There was no anger in her gaze, no fear, only an unsettling calm. And then, in a voice as steady as stone, quiet yet piercingly cold, she spoke. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." No one understood exactly what she meant, but everyone could feel it. Something was about to happen. Something big. Something no one in that boarding area would ever forget. Her words landed like a silent warning, heavy and unshakable. For a brief second, the flight attendant hesitated. But then, as if reminding herself not to take an elderly woman too seriously, she smirked and folded her arms. "It seems you don't understand the situation," she said slowly, enunciating each word. Her eyes flickered to the boarding pass in the old woman's hand, maintaining an air of professionalism. "First class is reserved for eligible passengers. If you'd like to board, please proceed to the economy gate." A murmur spread through the crowd. A few passengers exchanged uncertain glances. One man in particular, Dorian Blake, dressed in a dark suit, had been watching the interaction from the very beginning. His sharp eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't step in, not yet, but the way his lips pressed into a firm line made it clear he didn't like what he was seeing. Yet the elderly woman did not argue. She didn't protest. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering, the light from the terminal reflecting off the thin lenses of her glasses. Then, in the same calm and measured tone, she spoke. "I am at the correct gate." Lisa Graves frowned slightly. She had worked as a first-class flight attendant for 8 years. She'd seen it all. Passengers pretending to be in the wrong line, travelers trying to take advantage of clerical errors to sneak into a better seat. And she didn't have time for another one of these situations. With a sigh, she flipped the elderly woman's boarding pass over in her hand, checking the seat assignment. "First class." Lisa's brows knit together. That can't be right. An old woman traveling alone, dressed in a simple navy blue dress, no designer luggage, no hint of the usual first-class luxury. She didn't fit the profile, which meant, in Lisa's mind, this had to be a mistake. "Are you sure?" Lisa asked, her patience thinning. "Could this ticket belong to someone else?" "I'm quite sure," the elderly woman replied, her expression unchanged. Lisa glanced behind her, noticing the real first-class passengers beginning to shift impatiently. She needed to move this along. "Maybe there was an error in the system," Lisa said, her voice turning colder. "But first class isn't for." Before she could finish, a deep, composed voice interrupted her. "Miss Graves, I believe there's a very simple way to resolve this." Lisa turned toward the speaker, Dorian Blake. A frequent first-class traveler, sharp-dressed, with the air of someone who knew how to command a room without raising his voice. He stepped forward, his tone polite yet firm. "Just check the system." Lisa felt irritation rise in her chest. She knew who he was, a businessman who flew often. But instead of taking his suggestion as helpful, she felt challenged. And in front of all these passengers? Unacceptable. "I know what I'm doing," she said, cutting him off. She kept her tone professional, but the frustration seeped through. "We have procedures in place to ensure everything runs smoothly." The elderly woman still didn't argue. She just stood there, completely still. And somehow, her silence made Lisa even more uneasy than if she had protested. She needed to end this. Now. Without hesitation, Lisa stepped forward, reaching out to grab the old woman's wrist, just to move her aside so the others could board. And in that exact moment, she made the biggest mistake of her life. A slap. It wasn't hard, but the sharp, echoing sound of it cut through the entire boarding area like a whip crack. A beat of silence followed. Passengers froze. The old woman didn't stumble, but her cane slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor once again. And in that instant, Lisa felt ice flood her veins. She had gone too far. No one spoke. No one moved. Then slowly, the elderly woman bent down and picked up her cane. As she straightened once more, her gaze met Lisa's. And in that moment, Lisa felt something she had never experienced in her entire career. Not anger, not hurt, but deep, unwavering disappointment. Lisa's heartbeat quickened, though she tried to maintain her composure. There was something unsettling growing inside her, something she couldn't quite name. The old woman tilted her head slightly, as if assessing her, before speaking again, her voice calm, deliberate, yet sharp enough to cut through the thick tension in the air. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. No one fully understood the meaning of those words at that moment, but everyone felt it, like the quiet before a storm. The sentence hung in the air like a blade, slicing through the silence, making the surrounding passengers hold their breath. Dorian Blake, the man who had been watching from the beginning, narrowed his eyes slightly. The other flight attendants behind the check-in counter exchanged brief, uneasy glances, but no one intervened. Lisa Graves, the woman who had just slapped the wrist of a frail old lady, took a deep breath, willing herself to stay composed. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. This was just another difficult passenger, a stubborn woman refusing to step aside. And yet, a small, nagging part of her, buried deep but impossible to ignore, began to whisper, "Something isn't right. Why wasn't anyone saying anything? Why did the silence feel so suffocating?" The elderly woman remained completely still, showing no signs of weakness or outrage. She didn't need to react. She didn't need to argue. Her sheer calmness alone made Lisa feel as though she had just broken a rule she hadn't even known existed. Lisa cast a quick glance at the boarding gate. The first-class passengers were beginning to look impatient. They didn't care about this confrontation. They wanted to take their luxurious seats, sip their champagne, and enjoy the premium service they had paid for. Lisa needed to end this. Now. "All right, ma'am," Lisa said, forcing a polite tone, though the stiffness in her voice betrayed her frustration. "If you insist on staying here, I'll have to call security." The elderly woman neither protested nor argued. She simply gave a small nod, as if she had expected this all along. Lisa turned to her fellow flight attendant. "Call security," she said quickly, trying to mask the tension creeping into her voice. Leah, a younger flight attendant behind the check-in counter, hesitated. "Lisa, are you sure we can't just check the system again? I mean, if her ticket is actually—" "Leah," Lisa cut in sharply, her voice firm. "Call security." Leah bit her lip, but after a brief hesitation, she reached for the intercom and radioed for an airport security officer to report to the boarding gate. Lisa barely had time to exhale before everything took an unexpected turn. Before security could arrive, a deep, authoritative voice rang out from the back of the boarding area. "That won't be necessary." Every head in the vicinity snapped in the direction of the voice. A man, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, strode toward them. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his gaze sharp and unwavering. Pinned to the lapel of his jacket was the airline's insignia, a sign that he wasn't just another passenger. Lisa recognized him instantly. Gerald Hayes, the airline's head of customer relations, a man who never showed up unless something had gone terribly wrong. A chill ran down Lisa's spine, but Gerald didn't even glance at her. He walked straight past her, stopping directly in front of the elderly woman. And then, he bowed his head slightly. "Mrs. Lancaster, I apologize for the delay." The words hit Lisa like a bomb. Mrs. Lancaster? The name sent a shockwave through her system. Who was Mrs. Lancaster? A strange sense of unease curled in her chest. That name, it sounded familiar. Too familiar. Lisa's gaze flickered toward the surrounding passengers. A few of them seemed to recognize the name as well. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Something was very, very wrong. Slowly, Gerald turned to Lisa, his expression colder than she had ever seen. "Flight Attendant Graves," he said, his voice dangerously controlled. "This woman is a first-class passenger on this flight, and she is." He took a measured breath, as if holding back his frustration. chairwoman of the board. The entire check-in area fell into absolute silence. Lisa's ears rang. Did she hear that correctly? A cold shiver shot down her spine, so sharp and sudden it nearly knocked her off balance. The elderly woman, the one she had just slapped, the one she had been moments away from calling security on, wasn't just a first-class passenger. She owned the airline. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some passengers exchanged shocked glances. Others turned to Lisa with barely contained amusement, like spectators watching a dramatic scene unfold in a movie, right before the main character faces the consequences of a lifetime. Lisa wanted to speak. She wanted to explain, to justify herself, to insist that she didn't know, that she was just following protocol. But nothing came out. Because the truth was unbearable. She had made a decision about a person's worth without ever checking the facts. Lisa scanned the room. Dorian Blake stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mix of cold disappointment and something even sharper, certainty, as if he had known this outcome was inevitable. Leah, the young flight attendant Lisa had brushed off earlier, stood frozen behind the counter, her head bowed as if trying to shrink away from the mess unfolding in front of her. And Mrs. Lancaster? She was still looking at Lisa. Not with anger, not with outrage, but with a silence so heavy it felt like a crushing weight. Lisa had never felt so small. Then Gerald stepped forward, voice calm but laced with something unmistakably sharp. Well, Graves, do you still want to call security? Lisa parted her lips, but no words came out. Her career might have just ended right here, at this very gate. She stood there as if her feet were cemented to the floor, while Gerald's words echoed in her head. She is the chairwoman of the board. Lisa's chest tightened. The entire atmosphere had shifted. Just moments ago she had been in control, calling the shots, commanding passengers with sharp authority. But now she was the one on trial. People were watching. Some passengers pretended to scroll through their phones, but their glances kept flickering toward her, listening to every word. Others didn't even bother to hide their curiosity. They wanted to see what would happen next. Dorian Blake shook his head slightly, as if he had seen this coming all along. Leah, the flight attendant Lisa had dismissed earlier, stood stiffly behind the counter, her head bowed, but her tensed shoulders made it clear she was deeply uncomfortable with everything that had just unfolded. But the worst part? Mrs. Lancaster was still watching, saying nothing, reacting to nothing, just waiting. Lisa swallowed hard. She had to say something. She had to fix this. Now. There must be some kind of misunderstanding, she stammered, forcing a professional tone, though it cracked under the pressure. I was just following standard procedure, checking passenger tickets. Gerald's eyebrow lifted. Procedure? He repeated. Graves, would you care to clarify something for me? Lisa's face drained of color. You said you were following procedure, Gerald continued, his tone dangerously even. Did you check the system before asking Mrs. Lancaster to step aside? Lisa opened her mouth. Nothing. Because she hadn't. She had looked at Mrs. Lancaster. She had judged her appearance. And she had decided, right then and there, that this woman did not belong in first class. Her stomach twisted painfully. Gerald didn't need her to answer. He turned to Leah instead. Leah, did you check the system? Leah swallowed hard. She flickered a quick glance at Lisa, hesitated, but then, slowly, she shook her head. No, but I suggested we check. Gerald nodded, as if that was exactly what he expected to hear. Gerald turned back to Lisa, his patience completely gone. You didn't follow protocol, Graves. You followed your own prejudice. Lisa felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. A terminal staff member approached, looking uneasy. Mr. Hayes, I just received a report about the situation. No report needed, Gerald cut in, his eyes never leaving Lisa. Mrs. Lancaster will be escorted onto the plane immediately. As for Graves, she has a decision to make. Lisa's heart pounded against her ribs. A decision? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Gerald nodded, his expression unreadable. You have two choices, he said slowly. 1. You board this flight, walk into first class, get on your knees, and apologize to Mrs. Lancaster in front of every single passenger who saw how you treated her. Lisa's eyes widened. On her knees? In front of everyone? Her throat went dry. Or, Gerald continued, you remove your flight attendant badge right here and walk out of this airport as a former employee of this airline. The silence was suffocating. Lisa couldn't believe what she was hearing. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was a sentence. The crowd murmured louder. Some passengers leaned in, eager to see what she would do. Others shook their heads, looking more sympathetic than judgmental. Dorian Blake leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching with quiet intrigue. Lisa felt her entire world collapsing around her. And then, a soft but razor-sharp voice cut through the tension. "No need to kneel." All eyes turned to Mrs. Lancaster. Lisa nearly collapsed in relief. The elderly woman took a single step forward, her cane tapping lightly against the floor, a small sound, yet somehow commanding the entire room. "Kneeling doesn't make someone learn," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It only makes them feel ashamed. And I do not need your shame." Lisa swallowed the bitterness rising in her throat. Mrs. Lancaster turned to Gerald. "I want her on this flight," she said. Lisa's head snapped up. "What?" Gerald hesitated, his brows drawing together. "Mrs. Lancaster, are you sure?" She nodded. Then, for the first time, she looked directly at Lisa. Graves. The sound of her name, spoken by the woman she had wronged, sent a shiver down Lisa's spine. "You treated me as though I didn't belong in first class," Mrs. Lancaster said. "Now, I want to see how you serve me, now that you know exactly who I am." Lisa froze. She couldn't speak. Mrs. Lancaster held her gaze, sharp, unwavering, but not angry. "You humiliated me in front of everyone," she continued. "Now let's see if you have the courage to face yourself." Silence. Lisa's hands were ice cold. Her choice was no longer between apologizing or losing her job. Now, she had to live with the consequences of her actions. On a flight she once thought she controlled. Lisa had never felt so powerless in her life. Gerald sighed, then gave a curt nod. "All right," he said. "She will board this flight, and I will be watching her every move." Lisa's knees nearly buckled beneath her. Mrs. Lancaster didn't look at her again. She simply stepped toward the boarding gate and the crowd parted for her, the way people instinctively step aside for a queen. Lisa took a deep breath. She was about to board the most important flight of her career. And this time, she wasn't the one setting the rules. The first-class cabin door shut behind her. Inside, the atmosphere was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling terminal outside. Passengers were settled in their seats, some scrolling through emails on their laptops, others swirling glasses of wine, waiting for takeoff. But no matter how distracted they appeared, no one had forgotten what had just happened at the gate. Lisa walked in with rigid posture. For the first time in her career, she didn't feel like she belonged here. She was still a first-class flight attendant. She still wore the perfectly pressed uniform. She still carried herself with professionalism. But the way passengers looked at her had changed. Gone was the silent respect she had always commanded. Now their gazes were filled with curiosity, some with disapproval, and most of all, judgment. From his seat, Dorian Blake sat back, watching her. Not with malice, not with amusement, but with a look that said, "I'm waiting. Let's see if you've really learned anything." In the center of the cabin, Mrs. Lancaster settled into her seat with absolute ease. She adjusted her posture, rested her cane against the armrest, and turned her gaze to the window, as if everything that had happened earlier was already beneath her concern. But Lisa knew better. Mrs. Lancaster hadn't forgotten. She was waiting. Waiting to see what Lisa would do next. Lisa tried to fall back on instinct. She did her job. She moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts, assisting with luggage, ensuring every passenger was comfortable. But something was different. She wasn't confident anymore. Actions that once felt effortless now felt awkward. When she poured drinks, her hands weren't steady. When she walked down the aisle, her steps weren't sure. And every time she passed Mrs. Lancaster's seat, her heart pounded in her chest. Mrs. Lancaster didn't speak. She didn't ask for anything. She only watched. Not with anger, not with disdain. Just watching. And somehow, that was worse than any scolding, any reprimand, any public humiliation. Lisa realized something she had never considered before. Silence carries more weight than words ever could. She couldn't escape it. She had thought an apology would be enough, that if she acknowledged her mistake, it would all just go away. But the hardest part of making a mistake isn't admitting it. It's living with the consequences. After finishing drink service, Lisa knew she couldn't delay the inevitable any longer. She took a deep breath, grabbed a fresh glass of water, and walked toward Mrs. Lancaster's seat. "Mrs. Lancaster," she said, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "I brought you a fresh glass of water." Mrs. Lancaster looked up. For the first time since stepping onto the plane, she met Lisa's gaze directly. She gave a small nod, took the glass and set it on the tray without drinking. But instead of turning away as Lisa had hoped, she spoke. "Graves," Mrs. Lancaster said, her voice slow and deliberate. Lisa froze. "How long have you been a flight attendant?" Lisa blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Ma'am, 8 years." Mrs. Lancaster gave a slight nod. 8 years, she echoed, her tone devoid of judgment or emotion. "And in those 8 years, has anyone ever told you that you don't belong here?" A sharp knot tightened in Lisa's stomach. She knew exactly what Mrs. Lancaster meant, but she couldn't answer right away. The elderly woman simply watched her, calm but expectant. Lisa inhaled deeply, then shook her head. "No, ma'am," she admitted softly. A faint smile flickered across Mrs. Lancaster's lips. Not mockery, not triumph, but understanding. "Now you do," she said. Then without another word, she lifted her glass and took a slow sip of water. Lisa stood frozen, feeling something shatter inside her. Not her pride, not her anger, but the truth she had never been forced to confront before. She had spent her entire career making judgments about people, deciding who they were based on nothing but a glance. She had believed she was fair, professional, unbiased. But today, she stood on the other side, and for the first time she understood. Mrs. Lancaster didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. Lisa already knew. Lisa retreated to the galley at the back of first class, trying to steady herself. She braced her hands against the counter, inhaling deeply. She had always considered herself a good flight attendant. Fair, professional. But today she realized something she could no longer ignore. She hadn't been blatantly discriminatory, but she had allowed her assumptions to dictate her actions. She had never considered, not for a single second, that a woman like Margaret Lancaster could belong in first class. Not for any real reason, just because she didn't look like the kind of passenger Lisa was used to serving. And that had been enough for Lisa to decide for her. A wave of shame crashed over her, stronger than any reprimand could have been. The intercom chimed overhead. The captain announced the transition to cruising altitude. Lisa straightened her posture, smoothing down her uniform. She couldn't erase her mistake, but she could make sure she never repeated it. The first-class cabin sat under a thick, unspoken tension. Lisa remained in the galley, her grip tight on the counter. She had served thousands of flights, handled countless demanding passengers, dealt with high-pressure situations, but never, not once in 8 years, had she felt so completely out of control. She couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Mrs. Lancaster didn't have to demand anything from her. She didn't have to force Lisa to kneel or beg for forgiveness, because the truth had already spoken for itself. She had been wrong, but recognizing a mistake doesn't erase it. And now, Lisa had to face it. The hard way. Dorian Blake was still watching her from his seat. He didn't say a word, but his gaze, just like the eyes of every other passenger in the cabin, never left her. They were waiting, not for another drink, not for meal service. They were waiting to see if she had the courage to take responsibility for what she had done. Lisa took a deep breath, straightened her posture. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Her palms were ice cold. She had never felt like this before. Exposed, judged, stripped of control. But there was no escape. After a brief hesitation, Lisa stepped forward. No one had called her over. No one had forced her to speak. But she knew. If she didn't do this now, she would never be able to step onto another plane as a flight attendant again. She stopped in the center of first class, standing directly in front of Mrs. Lancaster. The quiet hum of the cabin seemed to dim even further. Passengers gradually put down their phones. Some sat up straighter, intrigued. Lisa could feel the weight of every gaze on her. She swallowed the lump in her throat, then finally spoke. "Mrs. Lancaster." Her voice was clear but strained. The elderly woman lifted her gaze. No expression, no urgency, just waiting. Lisa inhaled deeply before continuing. "I owe you an apology, not just for what I did at the gate, but for how I judged you the moment I saw you." A ripple of silence spread through the cabin. Dorian leaned forward slightly. A nearby passenger raised an eyebrow. Lisa felt every muscle in her body tense from the pressure, but she kept going. I've been doing this job for 8 years, and I always thought I could tell exactly who belonged in first class just by looking at them." She paused. Her tongue felt heavy. "But today, I realized that I was wrong." A few passengers subtly shifted in their seats. Dorian gave a small nod, as if he had just heard something worth listening to. Lisa bit the inside of her cheek, then exhaled, and continued. "You never had to prove that you deserved your seat, but I acted like you did, and that was completely wrong. I'm sorry." 3 simple words, but the moment they left her lips, it felt like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The first-class cabin remained silent. No one applauded, no one said a word, but Lisa hadn't expected them to. Because this wasn't a performance, it was a confession. Mrs. Lancaster's expression remained unreadable. Lisa knew she wouldn't forgive easily. Lisa hadn't expected immediate forgiveness. Mrs. Lancaster lifted her glass, took a slow sip, and then, after a few agonizing seconds, placed it back down. Her voice was steady, her tone neither harsh nor soft, but heavy enough to make the entire cabin listen. "Thank you for your apology." Lisa blinked, her heart still hammering in her chest. Then Mrs. Lancaster continued. "But I still have one question for you, Graves." Lisa swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am?" The older woman leaned forward slightly, her sharp gaze locking onto Lisa's. "If I weren't who I am, if I were just an ordinary old woman, would you still be standing here, apologizing?" The question hit like a hammer to the chest. A few passengers exchanged glances, as if they too had just realized what truly mattered. Lisa parted her lips, but no words came. Because she knew the real answer. And it wasn't pretty. If Mrs. Lancaster had been just another nameless elderly woman, Lisa wouldn't be here right now. She wouldn't feel ashamed. She wouldn't have been forced to confront her mistake. Lisa's throat tightened. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "No." Mrs. Lancaster nodded, as if she had already known. She didn't look disappointed. She didn't rebuke her. She simply watched, letting Lisa sit with the weight of her own realization. Lisa felt something inside her collapse. Not because she had been reprimanded, but because she knew, deep down, that she had been wrong from the start. And no apology could change that. Only her actions could. The silence in the cabin grew heavier than ever before. Lisa's confession, that she wouldn't have cared if Mrs. Lancaster had been anyone else, still echoed in the air. That answer hurt. Not just because she had to admit an ugly truth, but because everyone else had heard it too. She had thought an apology was enough, that she could bow her head, say the right words, and move on. But now, she understood. Apologizing wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Lisa could still feel the weight of the passengers' gazes. But this time, it wasn't whispers or judgment that unsettled her. It was the overwhelming sense that she couldn't walk away from this lesson. Mrs. Lancaster didn't say anything else. She simply returned to her book. But Lisa knew this wasn't over. She took a deep breath and returned to the galley. Leah was standing there. She didn't look sympathetic. She didn't look angry. She just looked at Lisa the way someone looks at a person who's at a crossroads. A silent question hung between them. "What are you going to do next?" Lisa swallowed down her unease, steeling herself. She had to do the right thing. She reached for a first-class meal tray and double-checked every item, more carefully than usual. And when she placed the tray in front of Mrs. Lancaster, her hands didn't shake anymore. Lisa placed the tray down carefully. "Ma'am, here is your meal," she said, her voice steady but sincere. Mrs. Lancaster looked up. She didn't say anything. Then, after a brief pause, she nodded. Lisa didn't leave immediately. She lingered a second longer than usual, as if making sure Mrs. Lancaster was truly satisfied with how she was being served this time. The elderly woman didn't seem displeased, but she didn't seem particularly pleased either. She simply let Lisa do her job, and for the first time, Lisa truly understood what it meant to serve fairly. Not because someone held power, not because she was forced to respect them, but because they deserved to be treated with dignity like anyone else. The flight continued, but for Lisa, it wasn't like any flight she had ever worked before. Every time she passed Mrs. Lancaster's seat, she no longer felt the same tension or dread. Instead, she felt the weight of responsibility. For the first time, she truly asked herself, how many times had she misjudged someone? How many times had she made someone feel like they didn't belong even when they did? How many decisions had she made based on what she thought was right instead of what was actually fair? Dorian Blake, who had been watching the entire situation unfold, finally spoke as Lisa walked past. "Quite the day, huh?" he said, his tone light but knowing. Lisa paused, turning toward him. "A long day." "Yes, but it was more than that." Lisa took a deep breath before nodding. "And a memorable one," she replied. Dorian took a sip of his drink, smiling slightly as if satisfied with her answer. "Then maybe you've learned something worth remembering," he said before returning to his reading. Lisa didn't respond, but deep down she knew he was right. About an hour later, as the plane cruised at altitude, Gerald Hayes, the head of customer service, entered first class. Lisa's stomach immediately dropped. Gerald never showed up unless there was a serious issue. He walked to Mrs. Lancaster's seat, offering a respectful nod, before turning to Lisa. "Graves, come with me." Lisa didn't ask why. She simply nodded and followed him to the cockpit entrance, where a video call was displayed on the screen. Robert Ellington, the airline's CEO, was on the line. A wave of tension flooded through Lisa. She knew this moment would come. She knew she would have to face the real consequences. Robert looked at her through the screen, his gaze sharp, not entirely angry, but assessing. "Graves," he said slowly, "I've been briefed on what happened today." Lisa inhaled deeply, bracing herself for the worst. Robert tilted his head slightly. "What I want to know is, do you understand why you're still standing here?" Lisa hadn't expected that question. She swallowed hard before answering honestly. "Because Mrs. Lancaster didn't ask for me to be fired." Robert raised an eyebrow. "And do you think you deserve to be fired?" Lisa froze. She wanted to say no. She wanted to say she still deserved her job, but she couldn't lie anymore. She exhaled, a sharp pang tightening in her chest. "I used to think I was good at this job," she admitted, "but I never realized that I let my assumptions replace my professionalism." She lifted her gaze, looking directly at Robert. "If I were fired, I'd deserve it." Gerald tilted his head slightly, as if evaluating her sincerity. Robert remained silent for a few moments, then he spoke carefully. "Then, Graves, do you want to fix this?" Lisa's heartbeat slowed. She hesitated. Then she took a deep breath. "Yes," she said firmly, "I do." Lisa had never been more aware of the weight of her words. Robert studied her. Then, after a pause, he sighed. "Gerald," he said, shifting his gaze to the man standing beside Lisa, "I want Graves enrolled in an intensive customer service training program. She won't just learn procedures. She'll learn how to truly treat people with respect." Lisa didn't resist. She knew that if this was the price she had to pay to make things right, she was willing to accept it. Gerald gave a small nod. "I'll personally oversee her progress." Robert turned to Lisa one last time. "You have 6 months to prove you deserve this chance, Graves. If you fail, there won't be a third." Lisa swallowed hard, but her nod was firm. "Understood, sir." Robert didn't say anything else. He simply gave a small nod, then the screen went dark. Lisa felt the slightest weight lift from her shoulders. But she knew this lesson wasn't over. She walked back to first class. Her steps were steadier now, but her heart still felt heavy. Mrs. Lancaster was still seated, her expression neither condemning nor forgiving, just watching. And Lisa understood. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be granted immediately. It had to be earned. She took a deep breath, then resumed her work. But this time she didn't do it out of duty. She didn't do it to preserve her reputation. She didn't do it because of pressure from her superiors. She did it because it was the right thing to do. As the plane landed, Lisa stood by the first-class exit, as she had thousands of times before. But this time she wasn't the same person. Mrs. Lancaster stepped toward the exit and paused right in front of Lisa. For a moment, they just looked at each other. The elderly woman said nothing. Then she gave a small nod. And for Lisa, that was a sign of hope. Life teaches us lessons in ways we least expect. Sometimes, our biggest mistakes become our greatest opportunities for growth. Lisa had made a mistake, but more importantly, she had learned from it. Have you ever judged someone based on appearances? Have you ever made someone feel like they didn't belong, even when they did? If this story made you reflect, share it with your friends and family. And if you want to hear more powerful, emotional stories that teach valuable lessons about kindness, fairness, and change, subscribe to Aiva Stories now. Like this video if today's story resonated with you, and drop a comment about the lesson you took away from it. Thank you for watching. See you in the next story on Aiva Stories.